Under the soft glow of Atlanta's evening light, Aisha Johnson stepped into the Ivory Tower, a luxurious restaurant, only to face scorn from the staff. Her dark skin and simple gray sweater marked her as an outsider, in their eyes, unworthy of their elite standards. Little did they, her husband, Daniel Johnson, a tech billionaire who revolutionized software, was moments away from turning their world upside down. If this tale of prejudice and triumph grabs you, hit that subscribe button to stick with this video. Share which country you're listening from. Where are you catching? Aisha's story. Hang around. The twist will surprise you. The sun had slipped below Atlanta's jagged skyline, leaving the city bathed in a twilight haze that blurred the edges of its steel and glass. Towers. Streetlights blinked awake, spilling golden light onto the pavement. While the low hum of evening traffic thrummed like a distant pulse, Aisha Johnson emerged from the community center on Auburn Avenue, her sneakers tapping softly against the weathered steps. At 32, she moved with a quiet resilience, her dark skin glowing faintly under the city's shimmer, her gray sweater draped loosely over her frame, paired with jeans worn soft from countless days of work, her hands dusted. With chalk from a whiteboard she'd been scrawling on bore the marks of her afternoon teaching leadership to black teens from the city's overlooked corners. Tonight carried a different weight. Aisha paused on the sidewalk, tilting her head to draw in the crisp October air, smelled of roasted peanuts from a street cart nearby, laced with the sharper bite of car exhaust. She glanced at her watch. Lou, 47 p.m., and a faint smile curved her lips. Perfect timing. She had one stop to make before heading home, a surprise she'd been nursing for weeks. In 7 days, she and her husband, Daniel Johnson, would mark their 10th wedding anniversary. 5 years since they'd locked eyes across a cramped table at the Ivory Tower, back when he was a pale, scrappy coder with wild ideas, and she was a community organizer with a spark that could light up a room. Now Daniel was a tech giant, white man, who'd climbed the ladder of a world not built for dreamers like him to share with someone like her. And Aisha was his rock, his equal. In every way, she wanted to take him back to that first night, to the place where their unlikely love took root. The Ivory Tower wasn't just a restaurant. It was a shrine to Atlanta's elite, a towering edifice of glass and marble smack in the heart of downtown. Its name whispered privilege. Its doors were guarded by unspoken rules. Aisha didn't care about its sheen tonight. She wasn't there to eat. Not yet. She just needed to lock in a reservation for next Friday, a quiet tribute to their past amid Daniel's relentless schedule of investor pitches and software unveilings. Her fingers grazed the phone, in her pocket, itching to text him. A quick guess what I'm up to, but she held back. This was her secret, a gift she'd reveal when the stars aligned. She set off her stride, steady cutting through the evening bustle. Atlanta pulsed around her suits, barking into phones, couples, clinking glasses at sidewalk cafes, a saxophagist coaxing a mournful tune from his horn. Aisha's gaze traced the skyline, the green glow of the Bank of America Tower piercing the deepening dusk. She loved this city, its grit, its soul. It was home even when it stung. As a black woman, married to a white man, she'd navigated its double, takes its whispered questions. But tonight, she wasn't dwelling on the weight of her eyes. She was picturing Daniel's grin when she'd spring this on him, the boyish one he'd flashed over their first meal when he'd vowed to build her a future with nothing but code and courage. The trek to the Ivory Tower took 15 minutes, her sneakers whispering against the concrete. As she turned onto Peachtree Street, the restaurant rose before her, its facade a monument to excess. Tall windows poured warm light onto the sidewalk, framing a scene of crisp linens and glittering glassware. Through the glass, Aisha glimpsed Atlanta's power brokers, men in tuxedos, women in sleek gowns, their laughter, a muted hum. She tugged at her sweater, suddenly conscious of the chalk on her fingers. She hadn't dressed up. Why would she? This was a pit stop, not the big night. Next week, she'd glide in on Daniel's arm. Her curls swept up her dress, catching the light. Tonight, she was just Aisha practical. Chalk. Dusted Aisha. She reached the entrance, her reflection flickering in the spotless glass door. For a heartbeat, she wavered. The ivory tower wasn't her scene. She'd rather be at a West Side dive, digging into catfish and cornbread, with folks who didn't bat an eye at her jeans. But this place held history. Daniel's nervous laugh over shrimp and grits his pale hand brushing, per hers, as he promised a life they'd built together against the odds. She straightened, pushing the door open with a faint hiss. The air inside washed over her, cool, scented with lavender and the rich undertone of aged wine. The dining room's chatter dipped a ripple of attention as eyes flicked toward her. The heavy glass door of the ivory tower swung shut behind Aisha Johnson with a soft thud, sealing her into a world that felt as foreign as it was dazzling. The air inside was a sharp contrast to the crisp October night she'd left behind. Cool, perfumed with lavender and the faint tang of polished leather, it wrapped around her like an invisible barrier. The marble floor gleamed beneath her sneakers, reflecting the golden glow of chandeliers that hung like constellations from the vated ceiling. Each crystal prism caught the light, scattering it across the room in a dance of wealth and privilege. Through the towering windows, Atlanta's skyline shimmered, but inside it was another universe, one of crisp white tablecloths, clinking crystal stemware, and the low murmur of the city's elite, their voices a velvet hum beneath the clatter of silverware. Aisha took a step forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished stone, a sound that seemed to ripple through the dining room like a pebble dropped in still water. Heads turned subtle but unmistakable, men in tailored tuxedos pausing mid-sentence, women in sequined gowns glancing over the rims of their wine glasses, their wineglasses.com. Eyes lingered, not with curiosity, but with something colder, sharper. She felt it instantly. That familiar weight pressing against her chest, the unspoken question of her presence, her dark skin and gray sweater, a stark contrast to the room's opulence. Her jeans were faded and dusted, with chalk from her day at the community sent her, marking her as an outsider in this sanctum of status. But Aisha didn't flinch. She wasn't here to belong, not tonight. She was here for Daniel, for their anniversary, for a reservation that would bring them back to where their love had sparked. The dining room stretched before her, a sea of pristine tables draped in linen, so white. It seemed to glow. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between them, silent as shadows, balancing trays of glistening oysters and delicate flutes of champagne. The air buzzed with the soft arrogance of wealth, laughter that tinkled like coins, conversations laced with names of power and profit. Aisha's gaze swept the room, landing on the Matrae station at its heart. It was a sleek podium of dark wood, a throne of authority in this gilded kingdom, and behind it stood Sophia, a woman whose tailored black suit hugged her frame like armor. Her hair was pulled into a severe bun, her posture rigid, and her eyes, those eyes locked onto Aisha the moment she crossed the threshold. Sophia's stare was a blade cutting through the space between them with surgical precision. It rad over Aisha from the unstyled curls, framing her face, to the scuffed toes of her sneakers, lingering on the chalk smudges that clung to her hands. There was no warmth in that gaze, no flicker of welcome, only a cold, calculating assessment that seemed to strip Aisha bare. She'd seen that look before too many times to count. In boardrooms and boutiques, on streets and in stairs. It was the look that weighed her worth by her skin, her clothes, and her very existence in a space not built for her. But Aisha had learned to meet it, head on, to let it slide off her like rain on glass. She straightened her shoulders, her breath steadying. As she closed the distance to the podium, the room's chatter resumed a low drone that filled the silence, but the weight of those initial glances clung to her like a damp cloth. She could feel the eyes still tracking her, some discreet, some brazen, as if her presence were a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. A man in a pinstripe suit muttered something to his companion, his lips curling into a smirk. A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears tilted her head, her brow arching in faint disdain. Aisha ignored them, her focus narrowing to Sophia, whose hands rested lightly on the podium, fingers poised over a leather-bound reservation book. Woman's face was a mask of professionalism, but beneath it simmered something harder, something that set Aisha's nerves. A light good evening, Aisha said, her voice warm and clear. Cutting through the frost that hung between them, she offered a smile, small but genuine, the kind she'd used to disarm skeptics and win over strangers. I'd like to make a reservation for next Friday if possible. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, her head tilting just enough to signal dismissal. For a moment, she said nothing. Her silence, a wall as solid as the marble beneath their feet. Then her voice emerged, clipped and cold, each word the shard of ice. We're fully booked for the next 2 months. Aisha's smile didn't falter, though she felt the sting of that. Tone deep in her gut, she'd expected resistance. Places like this thrived on it, but she wasn't here to beg. She was here for Daniel, for their 10 years, for the memory of his pale hand brushing hers over a shared plate a decade ago. I understand. It's busy, she said, her voice steady. Her eyes locked on Sophia's. It's for a special anniversary, my husband and me. This place means a lot to us. She let the words hang, a quiet plea wrapped in resolve, hoping they'd pierce the armor of Sophia's indifference. But Sophia's gaze only hardened her fingers, tightening on the reservation book as if guarding a sacred relic. The air between them thickened, charged with an unspoken tension that Aisha could taste bitter, metallic, like the edge of a storm. Sophia's eyes flicked over her again, lingering on the gray sweater, the jeans, and the dark skin that seemed to offend her very presence. Fully booked, she repeated her tone, final, a door slamming. Shut. Aisha's heart thudded, but she held her ground, her smile a fragile shield against the rejection she felt coiling around her. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The air in the ivory tower hung heavy, a taut thread stretched between Aisha Johnson and Sophia the Matrei, whose icy rejection had just landed like a slap. Aisha stood firm at the podium, her gray sweater a quiet rebellion against the room's glittering excess, her dark skin a silent challenge to its unspoken rules. Her words, it's for a special anniversary. My husband and me, this place means a lot to us. Still echoed in her ears, unanswered as Sophia's gaze bore into her with the weight of a judge's gavel. The reservation book lay untouched. Beneath Sophia's manicured hands, a fortress gate Aisha couldn't breach. The dining room's hum buzzed around them, clinking glasses murmured, boasts the soft scrape of forks on porcelain. But here at the heart of it, time seemed to stall. Suspended in the chill of Sophia's silence, Aisha's chest tightened, but she held her ground, her smile a fragile lifeline. She wasn't naive. She'd walked into enough rooms like this To know the game, how her presence, her blackness, her chalk-dusted jeans could unsettle the polished order of places built for wealth and whiteness. But this wasn't about them. It was about Daniel. About their 10 years together, about a night she'd planned to reclaim from their past. She opened her mouth to press again to weave her warmth through Sophia's frost when the air shifted. A sudden gust of arrogance cutting through the lavender-scented stillness. Footsteps, sharp and deliberate, clicked against the marble, and a shadow loomed over the podium. Charles Grayson burst into the badium scene. Like a storm breaking over a calm sea. He was a white man in his 52nd, broad-shouldered and loud. His tailored suit, a canvas of privilege stretched tight across his frame. His face ruddy from wine or temper carried the smug assurance of someone who owned every room he entered. He didn't glance at Aisha. Not yet, just barreled past her to the podium, his voice booming over the dining room's hum. Sophia, my table's not ready. What's the holdup? I told you I wanted the 85 Italian red decanted by... Now his words were a whip crack demanding entitled, and the room seemed to bend toward him, a ripple of difference spreading through the waitstaff. Sophia's demeanor flipped like a switch. The cold mask she'd worn for Aisha melted into a fawning smile, her posture softening as she turned to Charles. Right away, Mr. Grayson, she cooed her voice, dripping with a warmth Aisha hadn't been offered. I'll see to it immediately. Her hands fluttered over the reservation book, suddenly alive, as if Charles's presence had jolted her into motion. Aisha stood there, a silent spectator to this transformation, her own request still dangling unanswered. The contrast stung sharp, bitter, a reminder of the hierarchies she'd navigated her whole life. She swallowed it down, her jaw tightening, and tried again, as I was saying. But Charles cut her off, his head swiving toward her. At last, his eyes pale blue and hard as flint ran over her, taking in her gray sweater, her jeans, and her dark skin. In one swift, dismissive sweep, he didn't speak to her, not directly. Instead, he leaned towards Sophia, his voice dropping into a stage whisper meant to carry. I thought this place had standards, he said, his lips curling into a sneer. Who let her in here? The words landed like a punch, loud enough to draw a few heads from nearby tables. A soft chuckle rippling through the diners like a dark tide. Aisha's cheeks burned, the heat rising fast, but she rooted herself to the spot. Her breath steadying against the humiliation, she met his gaze unflinching. I'm just trying to reserve a table for next week, she said, her voice calm but firm, slicing through his mockery. Not dining tonight. Charles snorted a harsh bark of a laugh and turned fully to face her, his bulk looming over the podium. This isn't some dive bar, sweetheart, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured at her jeans, the chalk smudges stark against the denim. You've got to dress the part, or don't bother showing up, his hand waved dismissively, as if swatting away a fly, and he turned back to Sophia, expecting her to echo his disdain. Sophia's eyes flicked between them, her smile faltering for a heartbeat. Before settling into a practiced neutrality, she cleared her throat, a small, uncomfortable sound, but said nothing. Her silence a tacit agreement with Charles's judgment. Aisha felt the room tilt, the weight of their combined dismissal pressing against her ribs. The diners watched now, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes. A spectacle unfolding over their foie gras and champagne. A man in a velvet blazer smirked into his glass. A woman with pearls clutched, her napkin, her lips pursed in faint amusement. Aisha's pulse hammered, but she refused to shrink. This wasn't about them, she told herself again. It was about Daniel, about their love, about a reservation she wouldn't let slip through her fingers. Sir, she said, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the space addressing Charles directly. Now, Utation, I'm not here to disrupt it, just to book a table. Her words were measured, a lifeline thrown into the rising tension. But Charles didn't bite. He rolled his eyes, a theatrical gesture, and muttered to Sophia, "Handle this, will you? My guests are waiting." He strode off toward a table near the window, his laughter trailing behind him like a taunt, leaving Aisha alone with Sophia. Once more, the maitre straightened her composure, snapping back into place, but the air between them crackled, charged with the venom Charles had unleashed. Aisha's hands clenched at her sides, the chalk on her fingers smearing into her palms. She wasn't done, not yet. She turned back to Sophia, her resolve a steel thread running through her spine, ready to push past this new wall, blind to the chaos it would soon ignite. The echo of Charles Grayson's laughter still hung in the EA air of the ivory tower, a venomous thread weaving through the dining room's gilded hum. Aisha Johnson stood at the matrodiodium, her dark eyes locked on Sophia, whose silence had hardened into a wall of indifference. After Charles's departure, the reservation book remained closed. Beneath Sophia's hands, a mute testament to the rejection Aisha refused to accept, her gray sweater felt suddenly too warm. The chalk smudges on her jeans a glaring mark under the chandelier's relentless glow. The room watched some diners with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled smirks, as the tension coiled tighter, a spring, ready to snap Aisha's pulse TM'd in her ears, but her voice stayed steady, a lifeline in the storm. Like I said, it's for next week. I'm not here to cause trouble. Sophia's lips twitched, a flicker of something discomfort, perhaps before. Her professionalism snapped back into place. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper. "It's not about money," she said, her eyes flicking over Aisha's dark skin and her simple clothes. "We serve a certain clientele." The words landed like a blade, sharp and deliberate, slicing through Aisha's calm. The implication was unmistakable. Her blackness, her unpolished presence didn't belong in this temple of wealth. Aisha's breath caught a familiar ache, blooming in her chest, but she held Sophia's gaze, refusing to let the sting show she'd faced this before, carried it like a second skin. But tonight, it burned deeper, fueled by the purpose she'd come for: Daniel, their anniversary, their history tied to this very place. Before she could respond, a voice boomed from across the room, shattering the fragile quiet. "Some folks don't know their place." Charles Grayson called from his table by the window, his ruddy face split by a grin. He raised his glass, the red wine sloshing, as he gestured toward Aisha. "This isn't a handout joint." Laughter erupted in dark ripples, spreading through the nearby tables. Harsh barks from men in tuxedos, tittering giggles from women dripping in jewels. The sound clawed at Aisha's resolve, each chuckle barb sinking into her pride, her cheeks flushed, heat surging up her neck, but she rooted herself to the marble floor, her hands clenching at her sides. She wouldn't crumble. Not here, not now. The dining room's attention sharpened the spotlight she hadn't asked for. A man in a velvet jacket leaned toward his date, muttering something that drew a smirk. A woman with a pearl choker tilted her head, her lips pursed in faint amusement. Aisha felt their eyes like pinpricks, stripping her down to her skin, her clothes, her very being. She straightened, her voice rising to reclaim the space. "I'm just trying to make a reservation," she said, addressing Sophia. Again, her tone measured but firm. "That's all." But Sophia's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder, her hands still guarding the reservation book like a sacred relic. Then came the footsteps, brisk, authoritative, cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. Margaret, the manager, emerged from the shadows of the dining room, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that promised order. She was a woman. In her 42nd, her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, her black dress hugging her frame like a uniform of power, her eyes green and piercing fixed on Aisha as she approached, narrowing with each step. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged, directed at Sophia the Matrai, straight in her tone, slick as oil. "This woman's leaving," she replied, gesturing toward Aisha. With a flick of her wrist, Aisha's jaw tightened, the lie sparking a flare of defiance. "Actually, I'm not," she said, turning to Margaret, her voice steady, despite the heat in her chest. "I'm trying to book a table for a special occasion. My husband and me." She let the words hang, a quiet assertion of her right to be there, but Margaret's gaze didn't waver. It swept over her from her unstyled curls to her scuffed sneakers and settled into something hard. "Unyielding, you're disturbing our guests," Margaret said, her tone clipped, her head tilting toward Charles's table, where he watched with a smug grin, his wineglass raised in mock salute. Aisha's heart thudded. Disbelief, wearing with the anger rising in her throat. "Disturbing them," she echoed, her eyes flicking to the diners, their amusement now a palpable weight. "I'm standing here asking for a reservation." "How is that?" Charles cut in, his voice carrying over the room like a trumpet. "Some people don't get it," he crowed, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't your kind of place." More laughter followed, louder now, a chorus of disdain that drowned her words. A woman in a red gown clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a giggle. A man with a gold watch shook his head, smirking into his plate. Margaret stepped closer, her presence a wall of authority. "Enough," she said, her voice low but firm, her eyes locked on Aisha. "You need to leave." The command was final, a gavel striking, but Aisha didn't move. Her hands trembled, the chalk smearing into her palms, but her spine stayed straight. "I just want to book a table," she repeated, quieter. Now the words, a plea wrapped in steel. Margaret's lips thinned her. "Patience fraying, you're not welcome here," she said, her tone dropping to a hiss. "Not like this." The room seemed to close in the laughter and stares, a tightening noose. Aisha's breath hitched, the humiliation searing through her, but she held her ground, her eyes burning with a fire she wouldn't let them snuff out. This was for Daniel, for their love, and she wouldn't let it end here, not yet. The air in the ivory tower crackled with a venomous edge, the laughter from Charles Grayson's table still ringing in Aisha Johnson's ears like a taunt carved in stone. She stood rooted before the matropodium, her gray sweater clinging to her frame, her dark skin a defiant contrast to the room's pale opulence. Margaret, the manager, loomed closer, her green eyes glinting with cold authority. Her words, "You're not welcome here," not like this, hanging between them like a guillotine's blade. The dining room's chatter had dulled to a hushed buzz. The elite of Atlanta, now a rapt audience to the spectacle unfolding under the chandelier's golden glow. Aisha's hands trembled at her sides, the chalk smudges on her jeans smearing into her palms, but her voice held firm, a thread of steel woven through the fire in her chest. "I just want to book a table," she said again, quieter. Now her eyes locked on Margaret's unyielding stare. Margaret's lips thinned into a razor's edge, her patience fraying like a worn rope. "I've asked you to leave," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper, each syllable a shard of ice. "Do it now, or I'll have you removed." The threat landed heavy, a stone sinking into Aisha's gut, but she didn't flinch. Disbelief surged through her wearing, with the anger that burned hotter with every passing second. "Removed," she echoed, her tone rising just enough to pierce the room's hush. "How is reserving a table a reason to throw me out?" Her eyes darted to the diners, some smirking, some averting their gazes, searching for a shred of reason. In this gilded cage, Charles's voice cut through again, a bellow from his windowside throne. Some people need it spelled out twice. He crowed, leaning back in his chair, his ruddy face split by a grin. Get her out! Already, the words drew another wave of laughter, sharp and cruel, rippling through the tables like a dark tide. A man in a velvet blazer clapped his hands, once a bark of amusement. A woman in a red gown hid her smirk behind a napkin. Aisha's cheeks blazed. The humiliation, a living thing clawing at her insides, but she refused to bow. She turned back to Margaret, her breath shallow, her resolve. A flickering flame. She wouldn't let them snuff. This is ridiculous. She said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. I'm a customer, same as anyone here. Margaret's gaze hardened, her head tilting toward Charles's table as if his presence were a silent command. Enough. She snapped her tone. Final, a judge's verdict. She raised a hand, a swift, imperious gesture, and called out James. A young man in a black uniform emerged from the shadows near the entrance, his steps hesitant, his face a mask of unease. He was barely 20, his brown eyes wide with discomfort, as he approached, his hands hovering awkwardly at his sides. Escort her out. Margaret, ordered, her voice a whip crack that left no room for doubt. James faltered, his gaze flicking to Aisha, then back to Margaret. But he nodded, duty overriding reluctance. Aisha's heart thudded, a wild drum beat against her ribs. Wait, she, said her voice, rising now, desperation threading through her calm. My husband is... She stopped, the words catching in her throat, as Margaret's lips curled into a mocking smirk. Someone important, I'm sure. The manager interrupted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. We hear that all the time. It doesn't change anything. The dismissal was a slap, sharp and stinging, and Aisha's breath hitched, her mind racing. She wanted to say it. Daniel Johnson, the tech billionaire, my white husband, who turned your world upside down, but the words wouldn't come. Choked by the absurdity of needing to prove herself to these strangers, James stepped closer, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Ma'am, please, he said, his hand hovering near her elbow. Careful not to touch. Come with me. Aisha's eyes flashed to him, and then back to Margaret, her defiance flaring one last time. You're throwing me out for this, she asked, her voice low, trembling, with a fury she could barely contain. For trying to make a reservation. Margaret's expression didn't waver. You're causing a scene, she said, her tone flat. Final, leave. Charles chimed in again, his laughter a grating echo. Finally, too poor to stay. Huh. The room erupted once more, the sound of a dagger twisting in Aisha's pride. She stood, frozen, the weight of their scorn pressing down, crushing. James shifted uncomfortably, his hand still, outstretched, his eyes pleading. Ma'am, he murmured, softer now, a quiet urging. Aisha's gaze swept the room, the smirking faces, the averted eyes, the indifference of wealth, and something inside her snapped, not in defeat, but in resolve. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. With a slow, deliberate breath, she turned, letting James guide her toward the door. Her sneakers squeaked on the marble. Each step a drum roll of her exit, the laughter trailing her like a shadow. The glass door loomed ahead, a portal back to the night she'd left behind. As James held it open, his eyes downcast, Aisha paused, her voice a whisper meant only for herself. You'll see. She stepped out, the cool air hitting her flushed face like a balm. The city's hum swallowing the echoes of the dining room. Her hand found her phone, her fingers trembling as she gripped it, the sting of rejection, raw and pulsing. She didn't know Daniel's Bentley was already rounding the corner, its sleek frame a fast A.R. promise of reckoning she couldn't yet see. The night air outside the ivory tower wrapped around Aisha Johnson like a cold embrace. The October chill seeping through her gray sweater as she stood on the sidewalk, her breath fogging in faint wisps. The glass door had swung shut behind her with a final hollow thud, severing her from the dining room's gilded scorn. Her sneakers gripped the pavement, rooting her to the spot while the echoes of Charles Grayson's laughter and Margaret's icy command leave still clawed at her mind. Her dark skin prickled with the sting of humiliation, her hands trembling as they clutched her phone, the screen a dim glow against the city's twilight. She'd been cast out, her simple request for a reservation twisted into a public shaming, and the weight it pressed against her chest. A bruise she couldn't shake. Her fingers hovered over Daniel's name, hesitating when a low, resonant purr broke through the street's hum, a sound that turned her head and quickened her pulse. A sleek black Bentley Continental glided to a stop at the curb, its polished curves catching the golden spiel from the ivory tower's windows. The engine's growl softened to a whisper as the bee's driver's door opened and Daniel Johnson stepped out, a figure of quiet power against the night. At 38, he was a white man whose pale skin and sharp features belied the fire that had built his tech empire. His navy suit hugged his lean, framed the fabric, whispering wealth without shouting it, and his sandy hair caught the streetlight's glow as he straightened. He'd finished the meeting early, a rare break in his relentless schedule, and remembered Aisha's offhand mention of stopping by the ivory tower. A surprise, he'd thought, a chance to sweep her off her feet. He hadn't expected to find her standing alone outside, her silhouette framed by the restaurant's glow, a question flickering in his mind. Inside, the dining room hummed on, oblivious to the shift brewing beyond its walls. The chandeliers cast their golden haze over white tablecloths, the clink of crystal and murmur of privilege unbroken. Charles Grayson held court at his window table, his boisterous laugh punctuating a story for his guests, while Margaret glided back to her post, her heels clicking with restored order. Sophia stood at the podium, her black suit crisp her hands, smoothing the reservation book, as if wiping away the mess of Aisha's presence. The room had settled, the spectacle forgotten, until the glass door swung open again. A gust of cool air slicing through the lavender scented warmth. Daniel stepped inside his presence, a quiet thunder that rippled through the space. His height filled the doorway, his blue eyes scanning the room with a precision honed by years of boardroom battles. The chatter dipped a subtle hitch as heads turned, some with curiosity, others with recognition. His name carried weight in Atlanta, a whisper of billions and innovation, but tonight he was just a man looking for his wife. His gaze swept past the diners, past Charles's smug grin, and landed on Aisha's figure through the glass, standing alone on the sidewalk. A crease furrowed his brow, confusion hardening into something sharper, something protective. Sophia's head snapped up, her practiced smile blooming as she registered his suit, his bearing. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice smooth and professional, a stark contrast to the frost she'd offered. "Aisha, welcome to the ivory tower. Do you have a reservation?" Daniel's steps carried him to the podium, his shoes silent on the marble, his expression unreadable, but edged with a quiet intensity. "I'm meeting my wife," he said, his voice low, steady, a current running beneath the calm. "Johnson, Daniel Johnson." The name dropped like a stone into still water, and Sophia's smile faltered, a flicker of recognition widening her eyes. She knew that name. Everyone in Atlanta's circles did. A white tech titan whose wealth could buy this restaurant 10 times over. Her hands hesitated over the reservation book, her composure slipping for a heartbeat. Before she recovered, "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone brightening, though a thread of uncertainty. Whoa through it. I don't believe we have you down for tonight. Daniel's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locking onto hers with a weight that made her straighten. That's because my wife came to make one. He said his words, deliberate, each one a step closer to the truth he sensed lurking for our anniversary next week. She just stepped out, it seems. He nodded toward the window where Aisha stood, her phone still in hand, her dark silhouette a stark outline against the night. Sophia's smile froze her mind. Racing behind her polished mask, she just dismissed a woman in a gray sweater. A black woman who didn't fit the ivory tower's mold, but now this man, this name stood before her, tying that woman to a world she hadn't imagined. Your wife was here, she asked, her voice tiptoeing around the question, testing the ground. Daniel's head tilted, his eyes narrowing slightly, a storm gathering in their depths. Yes, he said, his tone still calm, but laced with an edge that made the air tighten. She mentioned our anniversary. You'd remember her dark hair, gray sweater. Sound familiar? The room seemed to hold its breath, the diner's chatter fading to a distant drone. Sophia's fingers twitched on the podium, her throat bobbing as she swallowed the pieces clicking into place. Too late. Outside, Aisha lifted her head, the Bentley's gleam catching her eye. A spark of recognition igniting in her chest. Daniel was here. Her Daniel. And the night was about to turn on its axis. A reckoning she hadn't planned, but couldn't stop. The glass door of the ivory tower stood as a silent sentinel, its polished surface reflecting the golden glow within and the shadowed figure of Aisha Johnson beyond. She lingered on the sidewalk, her breath misting in the October chill, her dark eyes fixed on the sleek Bentley that had just rolled to a stop. Her phone trembled in her hand, the sting of her expulsion still raw, a wound carved by Sophia's frost and Margaret Steele. Inside, Daniel Johnson stood at the Matra podium, his navy suits a quiet testament to his power. His voice a low rumble as he pressed Sophia with a question that hung like a storm cloud. You'd remember her. Dark hair, gray sweater. Sound familiar, the words, tied in the air, and Sophia's smile cracked her pale face, draining of color as realization dawned, a shadow creeping over her polished mask. Sophia's lips parted, a stammer forming, but Daniel didn't wait. He turned his steps swift and sure and pushed the door open, the cool night air rushing in behind him. Aisha, he called, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the city's hum. She looked up, her breath catching as their eyes met his blue sharp with concern, hers dark flickering with a mix of relief and hurt. He extended a hand, his pale fingers steady, and she took it, her chalk-dusted palm sliding into his. With a gentle pull, he drew her back inside, the door swinging shut with a thud that echoed like a gavel strike. The dining room's chatter filtered a ripple of unease, spreading as the couple stepped into the light, an unspoken challenge in their united stance. Everything okay? Daniel asked, his voice low, meant only for her, his thumb brushing her knuckles. Aisha's gaze held his, her lips pressing into a thin line before she answered, not kite. Her tone was steady, but beneath it ran a current of emotion, anger, exhaustion, the weight of the rejection she'd just endured. Daniel's brow furrowed, his eyes searching hers, then flicking back to Sophia, who stood frozen at the podium, her hands clutching the reservation book like a lifeline. The room watched the clink of glasses and murmur of voices fading to a tense hush. The air thick with anticipation, Margaret emerged from the dining room steps, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the marble. Her blonde hair glinting under the chandeliers, she'd sensed the shift, the disturbance at the entrance, and her green eyes narrowed as she approached, taking in Daniel's suit, his bearing, and Aisha beside him in her gray sweater. Is there an issue? she asked, her voice smooth, but edged a blade, sheathed in silk. Daniel turned to her, his posture unwavering, his calm a storm held in check. Yes, he said, his words deliberate. Each one a stone dropped into still water. I understand my wife was just asked to leave your establishment. Margaret's professional mask slipped, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she regained her composure. A misunderstanding, she said, quickly, her eyes darting between Daniel's unmistakable wealth and Aisha's casual attire, her mind racing to reconcile the two. We have certain standards for our guests. Her tone was practiced a defense she'd wielded before, but it faltered under Daniel's gaze. He tilted his head, his voice steady, but laced with an edge that made the air shiver. Standards. He repeated the word hanging like a challenge. What standards exactly would stop my wife from making a reservation? The question landed like a thunderclap reverberating through the room. Sophia's face blanched further, her fingers tightening on the podium. Her earlier dismissal of Aisha now, a ghost, haunting her silence. Margaret opened her mouth, a response forming. But before she could speak, a voice boomed from the window table, shattering the tension like glass. She was disruptive. Charles Grayson bellowed, leaning forward in his chair, his ruddy face flushed with wine and bravado. He gestured toward Aisha with a meaty hand, his gold cufflink glinting. Some people don't belong in a place like this. The dining room froze every eye, sweeping to Charles, then back to Daniel and Aisha. The laughter that had once buoyed his taunts was gone, replaced by a charged stillness. Daniel turned slowly, his blue eyes locking onto Charles with a precision that could cut steel. And you are, he asked, his voice deceptively calm. A predator sizing up prey. Charles puffed out his chest, undeterred, his grin widening. Charles Grayson, he declared, his tone dripping with self-importance. Regular here. I know how things work. He leaned back, expecting deference, oblivious to the shift in the room's gravity. Daniel's head tilted, his gaze sharpening. You weighed in on how they treated my wife. He asked, his words soft but lethal, a blade sliding from its sheath. Charles's confidence wavered, a flicker of doubt creasing his brow, but he doubled down, his voice rising. She didn't look at her. He waved at Aisha's jeans, her sweater, and her dark skin, as if they were evidence in a trial. Aisha's hand tightened in Daniel's, her breath steadying her silence. A strength he felt like a current. The room held its breath. The diner's faces a gallery of shock and curiosity, the air electric with the truth about to break. Margaret stepped forward, her voice lowering to a plating hush. Sir, perhaps we can discuss this privately. But Daniel's eyes didn't leave Charles, and Aisha's presence beside him was a quiet fire, unyielding. The confrontation had begun, a reckoning poised to tear through the ivory tower's polished facade. The dining room, usually hushed and refined, hummed with tension. Each crystal glass and silver fork seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. Daniel Johnson's voice cut through the polished air, calm but sharp. You weighed in on how they treated my wife. His words were quiet, yet precise, slicing through the bravado that had lingered at the table like an overhanging shadow. Daniel stood firmly beside Aisha, his navy suit, crisp and unyielding, contrasted against her understated gray sweater, their hands clasped, dark and pale intertwined, a visual statement of unity, of defiance. The chandelier's golden light cast them as the center of attention, a quiet storm before the roar. Charles Grayson's ruddy face twitched, a nervous smile faltering as Daniel's calm, piercing gaze settled across the room. But Charles clung to his bravado. She didn't fit. He barked, his voice rough, almost disparity. Look at her. The words meant to wound, echoed in the room. A final gasp of arrogance before reality pressed in. Daniel did not flinch. His voice, steady and deliberate, rose just enough to carry over the room's silence. My wife, Aisha Johnson, community advocate, board member of the Johnson Foundation, the woman who only wanted to book our anniversary dinner here, where we had our first date 10 years ago. The words struck like thunder. Marble walls seemed to shiver, mirrors reflecting the tension, and even the quiet hum of the chandeliers seemed to pause. Sophia, poised at the podium, froze, fingers gripping the reservation book, as if it could shield her from the truth. Margaret's green eyes widened, professionalism cracking like thin ice. Her mind scrambled to rewrite the narrative she had spun so carefully, but every argument fell flat under Daniel's weight. Charles's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, confidence crumbling like dry soil under relentless rain. Aisha stood tall, silent yet unyielding. Her dark skin glistened in the chandelier light. Her poise, radiating strength far louder than any words could convey. The diners' faces shifted as the tension rolled through the room. Smirks faded. Amused glances turned to discomfort, and judgment recoiled under the weight of truth. Daniel's gaze swept across the room, calm yet merciless. His next words were softer, but no less cutting. A blade tempered by love and fury. She came here for us, and you judged her by her sweater, by her skin, not by her worth. The accusation hung in the air, like a mirror pressed to their own prejudice. Then a movement stirred the room. James, the young staffer who had escorted Aisha, stepped forward. His black uniform hung loose on his slight frame, but his brown eyes burned. With resolve, she tried explaining. He said, voice trembling but strong. Several times, no one listened. He tugged off his jacket sharply and threw it onto the podium beside Sophia. I quit. I'm done with this. His declaration rang like a gunshot, shattering the fragile silence. Heads turned, and Sophia's composure cracked. James, don't be ridiculous. He shook his head, unmovable. A ripple of shock spread across the diners. The shift was far from over. From the back, an elderly couple rose, moving slowly but deliberately. The woman's silver hair was swept into an elegant bun. Her black dress, simple yet regal. Her husband, stooped but steady, adjusted his tie, hands trembling only slightly from age. Their footsteps formed a quiet drumbeat as they crossed the dining room and stopped before Daniel and Aisha. Young men, the woman said, voice carrying decades of authority. You're right. Her gaze swept the staff. Then the diners. Sophia, Margaret, we've dined here 15 years, but tonight is the last. This place used to value character. Now it values appearances. Her husband nodded, gruff but firm. We're done. Charles shifted uncomfortably, the wine glass forgotten. Suddenly exposed, Margaret tried to intervene. You're overreacting, she said, voice trembling, addressing the elderly woman. No, Charles, the woman snapped, cutting her off sharply. You don't get to decide what's right here. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Charles was in a spotlight he had never anticipated. Aisha's hand tightened around Daniel's. She drew a steadying breath, a quiet ache, lingering for the ugliness. Laid bare, triumph wasn't the feeling. It was a calm certainty that justice had. Finally, spoken. Daniel, she murmured softly, voice tethering him. Let's go. He turned, eyes softening, but fire still burning. Not yet, he said, then faced Margaret, whose hands were clasped in desperate control. Mr. Johnson, she said, strained, please, let's discuss this privately. but Aisha's words cut through, precise and unwavering. "You were clear about your standards," she said, gaze locking with Margaret's. "I didn't meet them." Daniel nodded. Decision made. "Our anniversary was about values," he said, voice ringing through the hall. "Real ones. This place doesn't fit." He guided Aisha toward the door, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble. James followed, voice breaking the silence as he caught up. "Thank you," he said, eyes fixed on them, gratitude and awe in equal measure. The glass doors loomed ahead, a threshold from judgment to freedom. As they stepped into the night, the dining room remained frozen, a tableau of shock, shame, and truth. Their steps carried them past the ivory tower's gilded constraints into the crisp October night. Stars pierced the urban glow above. Aisha's gray sweater brushed against Daniel's navy suit, their hands still clasped, a quiet strength binding them as they moved toward a future unshackled. 3 weeks later, the city carried the crisp bite of early fall. Aisha stood outside a modest brick building on Atlanta's west side, its windows spilling warm light onto the cracked sidewalk. A simple wooden sign read, "Calm Community Hearth." Through the glass, she glimpsed long wooden tables, crowded with families, workers, and loners in worn coats. Laughter rose freely, unpolished and genuine, mingling with the smell of garlic and fresh bread. This was a world apart from the ivory tower's polished surfaces and cold judgments. She wore a plain dress tonight, her curls loose, and her jeans chalk-stained from her teaching earlier in the day, traded for something softer, more comfortable. Daniel stood beside her, tea absent, sandy hair, tousled by the breeze. Tonight was their 10th anniversary, the anniversary of the night they had first stepped into the ivory tower together. But tonight, they had chosen this place, where worth was measured, not by wealth, status, or skin, but by care, connection, and humanity. A young server greeted them with a wide smile and led them to a table beside a family celebrating a child's birthday. Balloons bobbed above their heads, laughter echoing across the room. Across from them, an elderly man spooned soup into his mouth, hands trembling, yet his shy smile radiated warmth. Aisha felt the weight of the ivory tower's chandeliers and judgment fade, replaced by this unpolished, heartfelt world. Daniel reached across the table, brushing Aisha's hand with his pale one. "Happy anniversary," he whispered. She smiled. The ache of that night 3 weeks ago now, a faint echo, replaced by peace and belonging. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread that crumbled softly under her fork, but it was rich with care, intention, and the presence of community. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter rising spontaneously, uncoached, unscripted. A child smeared icing across his father's cheek, and both erupted into laughter. It was messy, imperfect, beautiful. Aisha thought of James. Days after the ivory tower confrontation, he had called her, voice cracking with excitement. With her guidance, he had pitched a program to the Johnson Foundation, Education for Struggling Youth. His idea had been funded, turning his own experience into a bridge for others. Tonight, he would join them as a guest in this welcoming space, a testament to the small seeds of change planted from moments of courage. The door swung open, and James entered, lanky, bright-eyed, jacket worn, but spirit unbowed. "You made it," Aisha said warmly. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, weaving through tables with a grin. Daniel's hand remained clasped around hers, grounding. "Affirming is what we wanted," he said softly. "A celebration that fits us." The room's clatter, the sound of forks on plates, laughter, and conversation was a quiet symphony, a harmony far more real than any polished dining hall could offer. Beyond these walls, the ivory tower had faltered. The Atlanta Journal's expose had sparked conversations, then outrage. Margaret had resigned, followed by Sophia. Sophia's letter to Aisha was a raw acknowledgement of mistakes. Both that night and throughout patterns of exclusion, she now sought to unlearn. The restaurant changed hands, a fragile vow to rebuild what had been broken. Aisha read Sophia's words, felt their weight, and set them aside. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a willingness to recognize potential for growth. She leaned closer to Daniel under the dim lights of community hearth. Worth isn't skin or status, she whispered. It's this, character, connection. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. You've always known that, he said softly, and you keep showing me. Outside, the stars pierced the urban canopy, a silent chorus witnessing their resilience. Aisha thought back to their first date, the nervous brushes of hands, 10 years ago, and the ivory tower's test of that bond. That night had tried them, pushed them, and revealed the ugliness of judgment. But here, in this unassuming haven, they reclaimed their story, their love, and their values. James leaned in, voice breaking through Aisha's thoughts. You two changed things, he said earnestly. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been pushed out. Aisha smiled, quietly proud. It's not over, she said. It's just starting. The night stretched on, alive with warmth, and the music of genuine human connection, simple plates, shared laughter, and the quiet pride of purpose filled the air. Beyond appearances, beyond walls of judgment, Atlanta now held a story of integrity, courage, and community. Aisha and Daniel's love had survived the ivory tower not through compromise, but through clarity, courage, and standing for truth. Here, in the soft glow of community hearth, they were free, and the world around them, even just a little, was beginning to follow